It's just a normal conversation. We should be
Let's
live,
go.
I think. Let me make sure that actually works. Yeah, I think we're live. That looks pretty good. I think. Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna retweet this with the links to make sure that everybody knows that this is happening now.
Maybe, let's see.
Yeah, that has worked.
All right, the first people are already watching. Amazing.
Cool.
Cool. All right, the tweet went out. I'm going to be watching I have like all of the chat here and Twitter here. So if any questions come in while we chat, I'm going to ask you those questions. And I think we're ready to get started. Why don't we start off with you two introducing yourselves? Who are you? Where do you work? What do you do in life? Where are you from? That kind of thing.
Yeah. What do you think, Fabrice? You want to go first, or should I?
Go first.
Okay. Well, I'm Christian Alfoni. I live in the middle of Norway in a town or a city, well, more town maybe, called Trondheim. And I've been developing for like 11 years or something. Got quite early into open source, really through writing articles, because it's kind of like this step where you where people kind of give you feedback, like you feel that you have something to contribute with. So I got that feeling through writing articles. And I guess if you know any of the stuff I've done, it's probably state management related. So it's like Cerebral JS, Overmind JS being the latest creation. But yeah, like we're going to talk about something completely different today. So it's not like I'm obsessing about state management, but it's just curiosity and trying to figure out different ways to do things, different perspectives, just generally trying to contribute with stuff. Yeah, and work related, I work at Code Sandbox. So super happy I was able to join them. It was like the stars aligned, and I was kind of done doing consulting, and yeah, it's super fun to work on that project.
Nice. How long have you been at Code Sandbox?
It's since last summer, but like the story is pretty old there, because yeah, and that was kind of fun when you invited me here. I saw our history, like our message history on Twitter, because I created that Webpack bin project, and that's how I got to know Yves, because he launched Code Sandbox a little bit after Webpack bin, and he's the same kind of person as us, as he's like super curious, shares everything, completely transparent. We just hit it off and started collaborating on some stuff. I refactored the whole client from Redux to Cerebral at that time. And now I've done the same from Cerebral to Overmind. And yeah, so I'm kind of deep down into the code base now, also in the broad perspective, like the whole thing. So it's super fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you work on the back end at all? That's all Elixir, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's Elixir. So I'm not writing the code there, which seems to me not necessary, because you don't really write code in Elixir. It seems like everything is it's super weird. But I chat a lot with Yves, who is writing the code, and in terms of architecture and stuff like that, trying to figure out how we're going to make this thing work, because it's very much it started as a hobby project, like all projects do, and it's still kind of a hobby project, and we're now slowly turning it into a professional product, but that takes a little bit of time. So
nice.
but yeah.
What about you, Fabrice? Where are you from? Where do you work? What do you do?
Yes, I'm from Germany. I live in a very small town called Wilhelmshaven, right there at the coast. And yeah, my story about open source is pretty different, because I work in a whole other business. I do Java development at a local company here. So I don't have a background in I don't do this for work, so it's just a hobby for me. So I joined Christian with his project Cerebral,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's talking English if you have talked the whole day in German is quite hard.
Yeah.
So yeah, I joined with Cerebral. I did the Babel plugin there for the tag syntax. So it's pretty minor detail. In Cerebral, there was this tagging syntax for retrieving path because everything was declarative, and I didn't like that syntax a bit. So I tried to firstly I tried using proxies, ES6 proxies.
Yeah,
that did work out great, but Cerebral does support Internet Explorer 11, so we can't use proxies there because you can't polyfill proxies.
Yeah,
you can, but it's a mess, so you don't want to. And yeah, then we experimented with that, and I watched Christian launch Webpack Vim. That was quite fun, and it looked like magic when I first saw it because everything runs so smoothly. Yeah, and then a few weeks later, Code Sandbox got released, and I very much remember that situation because that was I guess it was the dream project for you, Christian. So.
Oh yeah.
And then as you saw, somebody else released such an integrated prototype of what you wanted to develop. I saw some tweets of you where you were a little bit frustrated.
Yeah,
but
I can
in a
imagine.
good way because you got right into it and collaborated, and then you got a job there. So that's great.
So how did let's start talking about Class UI for a bit. How did that start? Why did you start building it? And then maybe that leads into what it actually is for all the people watching that have never seen it before, and we can walk through the docs a little bit.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not really sure how it started, but I think it started with I'm actually pretty happy about how things work, like writing CSS in JS and all that stuff. But there's always been this friction of moving a design from a designer into the code. So it's this itch where is CSS the abstraction level that you want to have as a coder when you talk to a designer. So that's always been in the back of my mind. And then suddenly I got lots of tweets on my feed on Tailwind CSS. And that when I started to read about that, I started thinking about Tailwind CSS as a different abstraction. It's like an abstraction over CSS because you're not really writing CSS properties, you're only writing class names. So it's still CSS, but at least it's not CSS properties. So and that helps you with constraining the design. And also what I realized is like these class names are kind of like designers talk about design tokens very often, and they kind of reminded me of the same thing. But of course, coming from like TypeScript and CSS in JS, and I didn't like that you had to configure so much stuff, and that you had to read the documentation to learn all the class names. So it really started with how could I improve this with the experience from CSS in JS, really. And then the first iteration was basically taking the class names library, if you know that.
Of course, yeah, Jed
just
Watson's.
a function. Yeah, exactly. It's super awesome. I took that API and I, like with TypeScript, I've been doing lots of trickery, developing, especially over MindJS, which is very focused on TypeScript friendliness. So I gotten to know the dark sides of TypeScript and how you can override things and get things to work the way you want it to work. So I basically put a TypeScript typing behind class names, which is the class names from Tailwind CSS. So that you got the lookup inside the editors. You didn't have to go to the documentation to find the class names. And that kind of just started spinning, and then it took a lot of iterations, but that feeling of having the tool in the editor was really appealing. And then I think it was the next day I woke up in the morning, and it's really funny how these things happen. It's not too often with me, but sometimes I wake up and I just have this clear idea of something, like, oh, this is how it should work. It never ends up that way, but you have that feeling. And I thought, like, what if we could use the API of class names, but we analyze the code so we know what class names you're actually using. So you don't have to pre-configure everything. It just automatically does it. But then, as always, when there's something I don't understand how to do, I bump Fabrice, because I kind of understood that we had to do something with a Babel plugin like we had done before. And when it comes to proxies and Babel plugins, Fabrice is my man, that's for sure. Yeah. So yeah. Sorry, Fabrice.
So yeah, sure. So for me, it all started when I was contacted by Christian. So it was kind of funny because we worked on Overmind a lot, and I did some Babel stuff in Overmind and proxy stuff. So I had some experience there. And for Can-See Dots, I developed an AST Explorer. I don't know if you know it. It's a platform where you can try Babel plugins, and I integrated Babel plugin macros there. So I knew that we could even use Babel plugin macro to support Create React App. And yeah, that all led to a very tedious route that we only had the Babel plugin and didn't integrate with any bundler. So we don't integrate with Webpack, and we don't integrate with Parcel directly. And we only use the Babel plugin to be compatible with all of these platforms. So yeah, that was quite a kind of lot of experimentation on the technical stuff, because we need to ensure that everything worked with any combination of tooling the user might have. So writing the styles, and so in production we generate a style sheet, a static style sheet. So that has to be generated before the bundler is trying to pick it up. And all of these details took quite a long time to work out. And then caching is always a problem with these kind of stuff. So Parcel is very aggressive in caching. Christian sometimes nearly threw everything apart. Yeah. So yeah, it wasn't that much fun, but we got it working in the end. So we had even then we had like 3 or 4 iterations on how we really want the syntax to be, and we ended up with something we could even implement using proxies now. So we could have a runtime development system where we don't need any transpilation or Babel plugin. But yeah, we would need to look into that if that makes sense, because the Babel plugin is quite performant now.
Of course, yeah.
It's quite kind of fast.
Why don't you show what it actually looks like, Christian? I think you have the docs pulled up, right? Start a screen share. Let's try that. And let's look at what class UI actually looks like, because I want to dive into what Fabrice you just mentioned. Just walk us through what it looks like and how people can actually use Class UI, what it looks like when you try to style your application with it.
Yeah. So basically, as I mentioned, it's the API looks like class names, but instead of having class names, you have this compose function. And then you have another import you do, which is called tokens. And on these tokens, you have, like in Tailwind CSS, you have kind of like categories of class names. where we actually iterated quite a bit, and we tried to mimic Tailwind CSS, but because of, we can talk about that later, but because of specificity issues and stuff, we kind of like twisted and turned the API quite a bit and ended up relying on CSS properties as kind of like the grouping of the tokens. And then you have the tokens themselves, in this case, like gray 20. And then when you have the token, you can give it decorators. So like hover and disabled and all these kinds of things. And you can chain them together. So after hover, you could add like disabled, for example. But the cool thing is like the iteration on this idea of, what do we say here? Discoverable and documented at your fingertips in the IDE, which is super fascinating. That we actually, when you write these tokens, and when you see the API, you kind of think like, oh, do I have to write all that stuff? But you don't, because you're using your IDE and it helps you. So for example, if you want to have blue 50, you write B5 and it gives you that. And then we can do stuff like insert a color there. We can give you the CSS it actually produces. We even give you the possibility to describe your tokens. So when you configure Classy UI, you can give tokens a description, which pops up and stuff like that. So that's kind of like how you use it at its core, and compose things together. And then you can, of course, combine that with React or Vue or whatever.
Yeah, so the output you get is basically a string of class names, if I understand that correctly.
Exactly. So during development, we have a small runtime, which injects these class names in a style tag on your page. And then during production, we have full control of these class names, which is so interesting. So when we build for production, we can minimize these class names to the absolute minimum length of the class names. Because their name is not tied to the output, because we know everything, kind of.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So in that case, you just end up with a string. There's the only runtime that runs there is related to handling specificity. But yeah, as Fabrice mentioned, we create a CSS file in production, which you then include in the header of your page, or however you want to load it up.
So I actually want to dig into that decision a bit because it's very interesting. In development, you inject the CSS via JavaScript. In production, you write out that CSS file, which gets picked up by bundlers. Why do you split that out? Why does production work differently than development? What's the benefit of writing out that CSS file compared to just injecting the CSS?
It's a good question. It's really a lot of decisions derives from Tailwind CSS. So that is like how Tailwind CSS does it. And then we created kind of like our goal of what's really good about, for example, style components is that when you lazy load components and everything, you kind of you create the CSS you need at the point you use the code, kind of,
exactly,
even on server-side rendering. It's super awesome. So we wanted to, in the trying to contribute with something new, we wanted to figure out how small can we make this CSS file? How small can it be? Because you never duplicate. You don't duplicate a thing. It's like it's crazy. Yeah. So yeah, that's the thing. Like if that resulting CSS is super minimal, and then you just load it in, and you don't have any runtime. We were thinking maybe that's a way to go in this world we live in, where everything should happen at runtime.
Yeah, right. So it's basically just a different trade-off, right? The way Classy UI looks to me as a CSS and JS developer and who's been doing this forever is basically that wasn't meant as a way to degrade anybody. I was just saying that because I've been looking at the CSS and JS paradigm for so long that it's just ingrained in my brain now, right? So when I look at Classy UI, to me, what's really special about it and different is this idea of writing token-based styles in JavaScript, right? It's still CSS and JavaScript because you're writing it in JavaScript, right? To me, that's really what defines CSS and JS, and people discuss about the meaning all the time. But really, what makes it CSS and JS is that you're composing it in your editor in JavaScript. And this idea that you could tie that into TypeScript is super interesting, and I think something that a lot of CSS and JS libraries could do better.
Yeah, and also like the fact that what was also very interesting about this idea, which kept us going, is this idea that we're taking something from CSS in JS. So it feels like a CSS in JS library, but we're using the Babel plugin to extract everything and then optimally produce the output. And that's also something which I was super excited about when you wanted to talk to us. It's like having this plugin is such an fascinating. We had so much fun with this. It's super excited. Like, can we do this and can we do this? And it's really a cool way to combine different approaches. So you're not like stuck in two different worlds. You can actually kind of, bridge them a little bit.
Yeah. That feeling of excitement is my favorite feeling ever. Sorry, go ahead, Fabrice.
Yeah, sure. So the main point I think Christian wanted to explore the developer experience here. So I think what we do differently is that we limit the CSS the developer can write by exposing just design tokens from that are generated by the designer. So in most CSS and JS solutions, the developer is free to choose whatever value he wants. With this approach, he can only pick from predefined values that adhere to the design system used. And combining this with the proper documentation and even the ability to link to different examples and integrate with storybooks. So we are using storybooks to run the tests. That's something Christian did, and it's quite amazing because it works really well with what we're using now. It's what is this called? The test runner for
Cypress. Yeah.
Cypress. Yes.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Because this is it's this what I think is a little bit missing, but there seems to be a trend now in CSS and JS. It's this concept of constraints. So like the first stuff that came up around CSS and JS was to write CSS, like CSS properties. But now you're seeing what's it called, system UI, and you have tokens, and like your last talk with one of my colleagues, Sid, having this token-based constrained way of implementing the design is really, really helpful, because just this concept of a token is something you can talk to a designer about. And even if you're just doing the project on your own, at least you have some constraints in place. So you don't have to, like, I remember when I got to this point where I realized that the REMS was just this insanely nice thing, because it gave me constraints in my way of thinking about implementing my own project.
Yeah.
But you can do so much more with it.
Here's a thought that I've had. I think that Tailwind is picking up in popularity is very interesting to me, because fundamentally it's the same thing that has existed for the past 5 years, right? Like we've had BaseCSS, we've had tachyons. Like this idea of atomic class names has been around for a while. What Tailwind really does well is it gives developers a feeling of having a tailwind, right? It has this system in place. The value in Tailwind isn't the class names. The value in Tailwind is the system behind it that just makes your app look nicely designed, even though you're maybe not a designer, right? It gives developers this feeling of, oh, I have the power to design things and make things look good without actually having to know design really well. And I think this idea of having tokens and building based on tokens is really the core aspect of that makes it work, right? So being able to get the benefits of CSS and JS with all the TypeScript benefits, right, is together with the token-based system has me very excited. All of the developments in that direction, I think this is for sure the future.
Yeah, I think so too. And also this idea that you can configure these tokens. So I remember this presentation from GitHub where they talked about their design system. but that they kind of like they have a design system and they have design they have a brand, and then that brand looks differently in different places. So GitHub looks differently than their blog, for example.
Yeah.
But it's at the core, it's the same thing. So that's also I think is quite exciting here, is that you can configure the tokens so that you give some more spacing, for example, and then that just kind of like flows out into all the spacing, it being padding, margins, or whatever these tokens are used. So you also kind of have that power. It's different than theming because you're kind of changing the underlying value in a different way. So
I think that Tailwind benefits from the presentation. So their front page is really nice and looks really great. So it's the design work that got into Tailwind is really awesome. So I kind of compare it to Bootstrap. It's so it's not like Bootstrap in the sense that you get predefined components, but the building blocks are much smaller, but the constraints on these smaller blocks are picked this in a way that lends to combining these tokens in a way that it really benefits the whole application, because you don't think in specific values anymore. You think in a more holistic way. So you think about the whole appearance of your application, and not only about the one pixel border on that component, because you don't use that class name. And the Tailwind UI library that got released, so you get some HTML you can just copy into your editor and get going, is really great, because the friction there is so small in comparison to trying out a React component. And what I noticed with various React components is that we are at a point where all these design systems exist, but you still can't really share any components really across design systems anymore. So with just using CSS, you have the smallest unit of comparison.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think something you mentioned at the beginning there really struck with me is this idea of, because you're only using token, I think what that really reduces is the choices you can make. You're no longer designing between a million shades of gray. You're deciding between gray 20, gray 30, and gray 40 in your case. And those are discrete steps on a scale. Those are very different, right? They're obviously still all gray, but they're getting darker or lighter depending on in which direction you go. And it's much easier to see something visually look nice if you're only choosing between 3 different steps on a scale rather than the whole spectrum. So once you have a good system in place where all these steps are clearly defined, in most cases, it's pretty obvious which step you should be using. If you add too much padding or if you use too dark of a shade of gray, it's going to look off and you're going to look at it and go, wait, this kind of looks odd. Maybe if I try gray 30, it's going to work out better. And that power, what that really does is, there's this famous talk by Ira Glass about the gap in any creative work, where you have great taste, but your skills don't match your taste. And you can tell when something's great, but you can't make anything great. And so you make a ton of stuff, and with every single time, you're kind of disappointed with it, right? And that's the gap. That's what people have to fight through in any creative discipline. And I think what these token-based systems do is they get developers through that gap by giving them a system to work within, and by basically allowing them, because most front-end developers in particular, have great design taste. They can tell when something looks great, but it's really hard to design something great. And so by giving them the system and these constraints to work within, they actually can sort of get over that gap and use their taste to develop something that looks visually nice without actually having to know a ton about color or a ton about space or a ton about like the specifics of working with Gestalt principles or shapes or whatever, right? Like you just follow the system and you try out which one looks visually the nicest. And if your taste is even remotely good, you're going to end up with a nice looking application if you use Tailwind. And that's really powerful.
Yeah, and Classy UI is this a little bit lower level than Tailwind, because we noticed that in the third or fourth iteration when we worked on it, because we tried to mimic Tailwind, but what we ended up building is a UI framework where you can build your UI framework on top, because we don't make these decisions for you. So the configuration is very bare bones we have. So the main goal would be to create a library on top of Classy UI, where you can then use these constraints and these tokens from that system.
Yeah, and I I remember talking to Sid, your previous the previous guy who was here, who used to work at Auth0, and we talk a lot about this stuff. And he mentioned how they use all these different frameworks and different products, and that got me thinking on, like, if you have this token-based approach, you can have like fundamentally like define or compose these pieces together, and then you can like we have this demo library that we're going to bring in when we release, that shows you how you can have these fundamental compositions, and then you use them in different frameworks to build components, and then you can just change the configuration if you want to adjust to different types of products, as I mentioned, with like a blog or a rich application or whatever. So it's really cool to see how flexible it becomes. Yeah.
Something we're working towards that's very much in the same vein at Gatsby is Blocks. If you've not seen Blocks, it's like a visual editor for React apps. And our goal with it eventually is to build some kind of page builder with it, where people who are not developers directly, who may be familiar with copy and pasting some stuff in WordPress, but don't actually code, can build websites, while still eventually having code to deploy and to share and to get developers to work on. And one of the things we need to do in order to make that work is to build a component library. Now that sounds really easy because there's a million component libraries, but the problem is we essentially have the challenge of building the component library, right? Because any component library you build should be used by every user of Gatsby. So it has to be interoperable. And the thing that we're using to do that, Theme UI, the whole principle of it is that everything is token-based. And that way, rather than experiment with building various components, people can then experiment with choosing different tokens, right? Choosing a different system to build within. And that's really powerful because in reality, there's not that many different UI paradigms, right? Like you have a sidebar and you have a main area, you have an accordion, you have a code snippet, right? You have a paragraph, you have a heading. The only thing that changes is the underlying tokens that exist in the system. And it's the same with Classy UI, right? Like you can experiment, you can basically build anything with just changing the tokens as long as you have the UI primitives to work with. And that's a really powerful approach that I think we're going to see a lot of, particularly in the coming. I hope we've been dreaming of this. We've been dreaming of this for years, but I think 2020 is really the year that we're going to get towards this dream where it's just we're thinking in systems rather than building individual components, which has me really, really, really excited. I want to dig into...
That,
Sorry? Go ahead.
Yeah, just a little thing to exactly to that, because what I saw on most UI component libraries, you have the ability to inject custom CSS, and that's the worst idea you can ever have, to allow the user to modify everything, because each property on a style component should be an enumeration and not a value, because only then you have the ability to change the underlying system. Because if the user has the ability to shift the component by 1 pixel or 2 pixels, then the whole system breaks and nothing works. So the other day, the spacer component in React was a thing. It got quite some recognition on Twitter, because currently components use margins for spacing, and that's the worst, because you can't place them in some context, and you assume kind of a pre-existing context to slot these components in, and you can't assume that in every situation. So you need to limit the ability of modifications to ensure a overall look of your application, and not just some messy string together components all over the place.
Yeah. Absolutely agree. I think the the thing you said there, use enumerations, enums, and not values, is really the powerful core principle here, right? We're restricting
It's just another
things.
name for token.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's
exactly.
tokens. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's tokens.
You're building a list of options rather than exposing the entire spectrum of possibilities, which is endless, really. For most of these things,
Yeah.
the possibilities are endless. You can choose any amount of pixels. You can choose any color out of millions, right? And I think that's really the
And
core
in
powerful
most-
principle.
In
Go on.
most cases, if you have the ability to just shift the component by 1 pixel, you're doing it wrong. So you shouldn't be able to do it because it won't look good. You might have a situation where you just want 1 pixel of, or want a border on that special component, but there are most likely better ways to achieve what you want to present, because these component libraries thought of exactly that use case before you did. So
Yeah, and also
in most cases you should be fine.
Yeah, and also the feedback loop to the designer, like it often ends with us, with the developers. But if we're constrained and we can't make it work, we have to go to the designer and tell them that this doesn't work. And then they have to come up with a new token, but at least then that's from a designer's mind and it's part of the system, and then we can move on.
Yeah,
It
I
sounds...
It ensures that the whole application is styled differently, because if that token is introduced, the whole landscape of applications the system is building, your company is building, changes.
Yeah, I think
so.
that
You notice that in Google's web apps, how many different design iterations can you have open of Google Inbox? It's insane how many different versions there are, or PayPal. There are very many different PayPal UIs you can still open today.
Yeah, I think No, I lost my train of thought because what you said was really great. I don't even know what I wanted to say. No, that was great. That was perfect. I absolutely agree. I actually want to dive into the specifics a little bit here. That was a total pun for everybody who got that one. I actually want to dig into the specificity issues that you were talking about. Can you explain what that means and how you solved it? What happened there?
CSS is broken. That's why.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
How it worked. I have to look at the documentation.
That's not how it works.
Yeah, but
we simplified it for the documentation.
Yeah, because the thing is, like, and this is actually something I learned during this project. I didn't know that the order of class names doesn't apply. It doesn't have any meaning. So it's the way you solve, well, specificity, for those who don't know, is when you have 2 pieces of CSS operating on the same element, on the same properties, and which one of them should win. In plain CSS, it's where it is in the style sheet. Like the bottom ones in the style sheet, they win. And I guess in CSS in JS, you solve it by like creating a unique class name for everything, kind of. Yeah, maybe you can. I want to ask, can you explain that? How?
Yes. So I have this really famous poll on Twitter. I did a poll on Twitter where I gave people a style sheet that had a class name .red and .blue, and then I put a div with class name red blue, and then a div with class name blue red, and I asked people what they thought the colors of the divs would be, and more than half of people got the answer wrong. And my audience is largely front-end developers. So most people aren't even aware of this, even though they use CSS on a day-to-day basis, right? The order of class names in the HTML does not matter at all. What matters is the order in the style sheet. Now, that actually poses a problem for CSS and JS libraries and class UI as well, because for us, we can generate unique class names for every component, and that's mostly fine. Where that breaks down is as soon as you introduce inheritance. As soon as you can extend a component with more styles, suddenly you have to make sure, you have to make sure that the styles of the parent component are injected above the styles of the child component. But then what happens when you have a circular dependency at some point? What if you have a circular dependency around 5 corners, right? Suddenly you can only have one order of CSS in the style sheet, right? You can't actually resolve a circular dependency. So style components is one of the only CSS and JS libraries who actually handles that. If you look at any other CSS and JS libraries, most of them get it wrong. And that's actually a large part of the reason. A lot of the code that is in style components and why the core style sheet engine is so complex is just to handle that edge case, to make sure that whenever you're inheriting and extending, it's the result you expect. And the way we do it is we just inject stuff twice. Literally. If you have a circular dependency, we inject at some point in the circle, we inject the same styles twice, just like in the different order, if that makes any sense. And then we apply different class names just to resolve that problem.
Do you inject more than twice? So for each cycle, or is
yes, for each cycle, basically we have to do it, right? So I'm really curious about how you solve these issues, because you probably ran into the same thing.
Yes. So the base idea is the same as for style components, because we only need the runtime for fixing specificity. Everything else should work as expected without that. And I guess the other question is specificity really an issue in most places, because Tailwind doesn't solve it. Tailwind UI and Tailwind don't solve specificity. They have one style sheet, and that's how it is. So yeah, that's another topic. But the real question here is our main goal was to fix it, because we want to compose different tokens, and we do need to compose that at runtime. And I don't know how experienced you are at developing Babel plugins, but a Babel plugin only has access to the file it's currently looking at. And you only get an AST for that. So you don't have any introspection into the code. You don't have any static analysis of the code in place. So you don't really know what you got there. So we have to do it at runtime. Or we would need a different tool. So it would be great if we could access the TypeScript compiler in a way that we get typings for each component, and even automatic type detection. That would be great, but we don't have that currently. So we came up with a kind of simpler approach that needed a little bit of runtime.
Yeah, and the way it works, it's like two parts to it. One part is whenever you, for example, it's best to use an example. If you use margin, for example, you don't actually use the margin property. We derive that into margin top, margin bottom, margin left, and margin right. So you can't use these CSS properties that composes in multiple properties, but you don't think about that. It just happens under the hood. And then we also have this grouping of the CSS properties. So this is how we know exactly what properties are in use. So if you're using margin, we have these 4 different ones. So what we're actually able to do then is to, let's see if we can scroll to the example. It's kind of like this. The documentation is getting a bit old on this one. But what we're able to do is that if you were using, for example, background color twice, this specificity function knows that you should only have the last one, because this is the way you think about it. So it actually fixes the order of the class names. So because that's why so many people go wrong, like at your poll. It's so intuitive that the order of the class names handles the specificity. And even though we don't talk class names here, but we talk tokens, but the order of the tokens is what determines what is put into the CSS. So
can you just, for everybody who doesn't quite follow the conversation here, can you walk us through why that red button class name is a problem in the example above? Because you have 2 background color declarations, but what do you expect to happen? And what has actually happened with CSS?
Yeah, so to take this example, you have a button which has a color and a background color, and then you want a red button which composes the button with a new background. As we talked about with CSS, you don't really know which one of them will activate, because you can't control the order they'll be inserted into the CSS. So what we know is that we have a composition here So we know that whatever you add explicitly to that composition is what you as a developer would want. Like that's what you want.
Yes.
So with this example, looking at the code of Classy UI, you would compose like a button and you would add background color. And that makes it possible for us to see that, okay, we have a composition here. We don't know what's inside button. We have no idea, but we know that you want a background color.
Mm-hmm.
So this function just ensures that if button has a background color, it will remove it from the resulting class names.
Yeah.
So that you will only have one background color, one margin top, one padding left, and so on. So, and that wasn't obvious to us. It took some iteration to come up with that solution, but it's really fascinating. It was really fun when we figured this stuff out. Like we can talk about Classy UI as a library and how do you like it and does it work in your flow and all that stuff. But like this solution, I think this is really cool.
I like this a lot because it uses the same API that you use to compose tokens. And it's the same thing, right? Like you're composing tokens into a single thing that can then be used. You're combining them. And so in this case, you're just combining an already existing set of tokens from a different class name or a different use, or I don't know, I don't even know what to call that, from a different thing with an extra override.
Composition.
Yeah, composition. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were going to say, Fabrice?
Yes, we ended up here because we shifted from Tailwind. If we would have used the Tailwind configuration for the CSS, this wouldn't work. Because if you would scroll a little bit up, you can see that we use these double underlines to differentiate between the property name and the actual token we are applying to it. So we can then extract, split the string basically on every of these instances, and then ensure that we remove everything but the last occurrence of each tag. And this is another detail for our production CSS. I don't know if you have seen production CSS that is generated by Classy UI. We keep this structure of class, so a type of the property of the class name and the actual token, even in the generated production ready CSS. So yeah. And we can use the same function to do the injecting and specificity fix.
So in production, it would just then be minified, right? You wouldn't have background color underscore. You would have a underscore. Yeah, right.
That's the funny thing. It's like everybody kind of has the same style sheet, no matter what application you write, because every time it starts at AA, and then whenever the property changes, it goes from A to B, and then whenever the token changes, it goes from the second part changes. So
and that also
super,
kind of
super short
infers from this use of tokens because it's a scale, so you can just count, right? You can just count the unique properties and go from, in this case, A to Z, but really it's 1 to 26, right? Like you can go, you can just count to minify, which is a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it's maybe we could show this is how they are defined. So for example, background origin, you can see that you have the tokens, what value they represent, and in this case they also have a description, and then we produce the actual CSS, how it's going to look. And then if we look at margin, we see that the CSS property isn't the actual CSS, it's deriving into, well, I guess it's a different word when you're deriving into something than from something, but yeah, you get the idea. It's not, we're not defining the CSS, but we're just saying use this on margin top, margin right, margin bottom.
Super interesting. Is this structure used for the types too? Do you use the same JSON object to generate the types?
Yes.
Or is nice?
Yeah, that's transform classes to types.
Yes,
This is where it happens.
Nice.
I recently learned that the concept Classy UI is using for generating runtime typing of your configuration, or it's not runtime configuration, but it's kind of yeah, funny story how that happened, because we generate the TypeScript typings inside the Babel plugin. So the Babel plugin is collecting all the used class names and generates the TypeScript definition based on the actual configuration the project is using. So that's kind of and I shared this with Christian yesterday. Prisma calls these smart modules. So Prisma 2, I don't know, it's a GraphQL ORM and database. It's not an ORM, it's a little bit more than that, but it's it uses these kind of smart modules to generate runtime code based on the schema of your database, and we are generating CSS tokens based on the configuration the designer is. These are the tokens we support.
Interesting. Yeah. I hadn't considered the parallel to Prisma before, but that makes total sense. Huh.
Yeah, and it's really powerful this because when you first put stuff into the IDE as kind of like documentation, it's really nice when you change the configuration that the documentation updates as well. Yes. So that's really cool, and that also took some iterations to figure out, especially like Fabrice mentions, it's all happening in a Babel plugin, and if you don't know how Babel plugins work, it's a challenge because as I mentioned, it's one file at a time, and just building the production CSS, when do you do that? You don't know when you're on the last file. So we have some we do it when the process exits. So
and we tested each bundler and ensured that it works correctly. Yeah, it's kind of funny.
No, that works.
That works.
That is incredible.
Then we had problems with Next.js, because Next.js assumes the existence of the style sheet before. So the inclusion of the style sheet in the head. No, I need to start the other way around. Next.js can't include CSS files inside your components. You need to include the CSS inside the -app.js.
Yeah.
Or TS. And that's kind of challenging. So Next.js is kind of special. We have some documentation for Next.js that is
I think it's working really nicely now. I remember we had some issues with it, but it should be working quite okay now.
We need to specify the output public, because we can't include the actual. So I think I should have explained it before. What we are doing for Create React App and everything else is we just generate an include statement, import statement for the style sheet in every file we process. So in every file we find a class name, a token that is used. We just generate the import statement for the style sheet, and assume that the bundler is getting rid of that duplication there, and it works fine in most bundlers, because they pre-shake the component and notice that the style sheet was imported, and just ignore it.
Yeah, right. Interesting. I see.
So we have the main development cycle was to change something and try it in all different contexts Classy UI should run.
Yeah. So typically you give it, and like as you do with most bundling, you have to give it like an output. Though it depends on if the bundling tool is doing some output by itself. Like for example, I don't remember if it's Parcel, which has like a separate folder for static files, or maybe that was Gatsby actually.
Possibly.
Maybe you should know that, possibly. But anyways, some of these frameworks that has bundlers inside them, they have a specific folder for static files. So it's like as Fabrice is talking about, it's like a race condition. Like, does it create the file at the correct time? So we have had to go through everything, like all the tools and ensure that you do it the proper way so that you don't get into that race condition. And it's all like, we've been so many times like, oh, do we have to create a Webpack loader? Do we have to create this? Do we have to? No, we want this to work only with the Bubble plugin, and only if it's like an exercise in with like, that's when good ideas often come up. It's when you create these artificial constraints.
Yeah.
So our artificial constraint was the Bubble plugin. We want this to work only with the Bubble plugin, and so far it does.
That's pretty incredible.
Here's some funny story. We or Christian found a bug in VS Code. They released an update where we used the semantic highlighting. I guess if we go to the start page again on the documentation,
Oh yeah,
you can see the tokens we use are highlighted by the IDE. So that is something some themes implement. So if you have a static constant and it's capitalized, then it gets a special color in some themes. And with a VS Code update, that broke. So
yeah.
it was kind of funny because in some cases it did work, but if you had a number in it, it didn't work anymore. And so yeah, that was very strange, because it's kind of nice to have this visual feedback on what is a token and what is your property.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And that's also a really interesting point, because when you look at this example, you see the color there and you don't really think about it, that it's there. Like, and we didn't know that. It was just suddenly one day we were like halfway through the process and I'm writing this down and suddenly I see the color changes. And like, oh shit, of course the token should be like all uppercase and we should structure them like this, because then you get it into your face, like the important stuff. And it's kind of funny how these things pop up. Like, it's very much not planned out this way. It just happens along the way.
Nice. That's serendipity at work.
Yeah.
Tom Thornton in the stream chat says, I like this a lot. So you've convinced at least one person.
Ooh.
Yeah, but all of this was like, some projects I worked on is to scratch my own itch. Like, I have, like, to actually make the project work, I want to do it differently, and then I implement it and I use it while I implement it. But this project was more of a curiosity thing. So when I created a video on the initial class names with TypeScript, there was so much feedback on it. So this is the first project where it's more like feedback driven than pleasing myself. And it's been a different process for me than doing my previous projects, where I'm definitely trying to please myself. Oh, that sounds bad. So sorry. But the point is that when you create it for yourself as well, you have a very different approach to feedback, because you kind of want it to work the way you want it to, but you're trying to be like political and stuff. But in this case, it has only been feedback driven. It's been like a proper product development kind of, which has been super interesting.
I think the audience is much bigger on all CSS related content than state management. So that's it's insane how fast you got feedback on the videos. So it's really fun, and how fast people jumped on Classy UI and built their blogs with it and tried it out. With state management libraries, you don't get that. I noticed that while diving into Cerebral back in the days where I had some work done there, and in Cerebral and with Overmind, we learned from our own experience with working with Classy, with Cerebral or Overmind, and with proxies and TypeScript. But with state libraries, you don't get that much of feedback, because the investment is so big in state management libraries, and the market is kind of saturated with Redux and Relay and all the other solutions that are widely adopted, and you can't expect somebody to change the underlying state management solution mid project. That doesn't happen.
There's more room for innovation in this space, it seems.
And it's much more discussed, I guess.
But I also think
yeah,
it's not solved yet. It's part of the thing with CSS is that it's still pretty painful to style something, right? And now people always say that I don't know CSS or like because I make CSS in JS, I'm a complete idiot and I don't know what I'm doing. But really, styling an application or a website is still way more complicated than it should be because it's always the same thing. Like it's not that different, right?
Yeah.
Most websites look the same. Like we said, the only thing that really changes is the tokens and how you compose, like in what order you compose the components, which layout you get out of it. But really, it shouldn't be like there's a visceral. I think the reason CSS is so enticing to people is because there's this visceral feeling of we could be doing this in a much better way, right? Like it feels viscerally tedious. You know what I mean? And I don't say that as a hate against CSS at all. I really like CSS actually. I think the fact that it's evolved over time and it's gotten so good and it enables all of these things is amazing. It's a great primitive abstraction, but it's primitive. It's very low level, right? It's very low level.
It's an abstraction not made for what we are using it today.
Yeah.
It's an abstraction to style documents and not applications.
Yeah, and I think the fact that
it's created in a time.
Yeah, I think the fact that it's scaled to be able to
sorry.
I think the fact that it's scaled to be able to style applications is actually fascinating. I think that really that's really a great compliment to the designers of CSS because they designed a very flexible API that works for basically everything, right? But it's because it works for everything, it doesn't work well for anything. And I think a lot of these
it's just like JavaScript. You can build a application with just JavaScript if you don't want to.
Exactly.
And it won't look nice and won't work in all cases and won't be accessible and all the things we get for free with using components that are already made.
Absolutely agree.
Also, like I compare it to like writing web apps in C++ instead of JavaScript. It's so low level and specificity is like handling memory issues. You have to assign
I like that analogy a lot.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's actually a great place to end it. We've been at it for an hour. Thank you for coming on. Is there anything you want to say? Any last words? Where should people go to find you or Classy UI? What should they check out? What should they read?
That's a good question. Well, Classy UI is on classy-ui.io, and we're still in, as it says here, beta. But we solved the last there was actually last specificity issue, but we don't have time for that. But it's solved, and we're just about to release it. So super excited about the feedback there. Other than that, I just want to wish everyone a great weekend, I think. Yep.
That's awesome.
Fabrice, you go.
Yeah. I think that what Christian said is wraps it up. Great. And yeah, everybody a great weekend and stay healthy. Nice.
I like that. All right, I'm going to end the stream here. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to follow Christian and Fabrice, at Christian Alfoni and at FVineB, I also tweeted about it, so you can just click on their handles. See you at the next live chat. This was awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.